Hi, welcome to episode 21 of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. His name is Dag Herbjornsrud. He's a historian of ideas. He's an author, Aeon writer, and founder of Center for Global and Comparative History of Ideas in Oslo. Welcome, Dag.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
And thank you so much for coming on with us today, Dag.
Yeah, sure. It's a pleasure.
So
Thank you.
the reason why I wanted to have Dag on today, guys, is because from the articles that I've written, or wrote, the articles that I've read so far. So Dag has covered really interesting topics in the area of philosophy and history, especially in the context of the philosophy of ideas and kind of where ideas come from, right? Sort of how they evolved, and even kind of how they've been suppressed, which I thought was really important. So one of Dag's phenomenal articles is called "The Non-European Women Who Founded Philosophy," and just I wanted to kind of start with a quote from there and to kind of talk to you a little bit about it, Dag. So,
Yeah.
in the article, Dag writes, "One day it might become possible to include the voices of marginalized philosophical women again. These women highlighted the questions that were most pressing in their time and theorized philosophical answers that still need to be discussed in the 21st century. Philosophy was once a women's world. It is time to reclaim some of that lost realm." So,
Oh, wow.
yeah. So, Dag, can you talk a little bit about that and kind of how let's say, how the philosophy of different types of prominent women has been suppressed throughout history?
Right. Now, what I did was actually start with the Indian philosophy, the Upanishads, and those texts are approximately 2,700 years old. So that means it's a couple of hundreds of years older than Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the women who are mentioned, or are one of them, that's Gargi. Now, and she is a pretty fierce woman. She stands up against one of the other men, the men philosophers, and she reclaims her time, so to say, and she starts a very interesting conversation with Jaina Valkya, who is the main philosopher in the first of the Upanishads. And they discuss back and forth when it comes to the complexity of the world, how the world or the universe is created. And another woman, that's Maitreyi, and she has actually given the name to a college in New Delhi from 1967,
Wow.
the Maitreyi College at the New Delhi University, and she has a very interesting conversation with her man or peer. Her peer man, who is actually discussing what is the point of having anything in this world if we can't take it with us when we die. So that's two examples of women who have been, how to say, suppressed from the history of philosophy at least for the last couple of hundred years.
Mm-hmm. And what was the answer? What conclusion did she come to? Is there a point to having anything important or trying for anything so hard if we can't take it with you upon death?
Right. No, yeah, exactly. That's what she found out, that the material gains of this world is nothing important in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So, you got to read it. It's rather complex, but I think it's actually a discussion which is, how to say, very into the modern day world. I mean, for the 21st century, I think these texts of the Upanishads, they are gaining more and more ground when we are thinking about climate change and other existential issues of the time.
Yeah. And so, in which cultures have you found women to be the most prominent in terms of academia?
Well, Actually, I on all continents. Actually, so I did start with India. There are so the women are rather central in this first and oldest Upanishad, and that means the beginning of philosophy, as Schopenhauer would have said it. He was a great fan. Was a great fan of the Upanishads and the Indian philosophy. When you go to the Mahabharata, we can see Sulabha, for example. And in the 13th century, there is Akka Mahadevi, and she is another thinker and poet, philosopher, writer. And so in Indian tradition there are many, and if we go to the Chinese tradition, we have Ban Shao, for example. She's an historian, writer, and actually a rather feminist text that she wrote 2,100 years ago.
And what was feminist philosophy like on those continents? What did it encompass?
Well, yeah, the Indian and the Gargi episode, so to say, that was rather standing up for her rights as a female thinker or a female voice. Ban Shao, she's, how to say, more traditional, somebody will say. She has been presented as rather traditional because she wrote a book that explains how women should behave or girls should behave in society. And some will say it's a rather, how to say, conservative. But it depends on depends on the point of view, I would say, because she says rather explicitly that boys and girls should learn to teach and write in the same manner. So that was a rather strong argument, I would say, that women should learn to read and write at that time. And throughout, also when it comes to Confucius or Confuci, he was one of the main founders, of course, of Confucianism. He also referred to women philosophers or women thinkers, and he argued that they were, how to say, his equals. And we can see that also far later in Chinese philosophy, in the 16th century, when he refers to Maid Iran, and he writes letters to her, and they have a back and forth conversation when it comes to philosophy. So that was China. And we can see something similar in South Korea. In the 17th century, especially, we can see in the Arab and Muslim world, we, for example, have Arabia, who is actually one of the founders of Sufism within Islam, right? Which is, I don't know how familiar people are with Sufism within Islam.
Well, just for our audience, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Right. Well, that's rather complex, but
actually, it's the mystical sect of Islamic religion, right? It's more of the philosophical, spiritual, mystic side of it, right?
Right. You might say, you might say that, and I'm a little bit hesitant how to say to describe it, because whatever I say will be, how to say, not complex or well described. It's rather complex, but you pretty much summarized it, and it has been pretty influential throughout history. This Sufism, the Sufi way of thinking within Islam. and Rabia of Basra. Now, Basra is a city in today's Iraq, and she was born approximately, around the year 800 or in the 8th century. So that means some 150 years after Muhammad, and she is recognized as one of the founders of Islam, or I'm sorry, founders of Sufi Islam. Yes. So she's one of the important voices, and she is famous for, how to say, going around in the streets and telling people to, how to say, embrace God. And her philosophical way of, how to say, having this personal connection with God, that also influenced Sufism throughout the centuries. So we have books from the 12th century, for example, written by male Arab Muslims, and they have actually a book which describes 80 different women.
Wow.
Who are rather important within this Sufi Islam movement.
Yeah.
And later on, we also have Asia al-Bawunya in the 15th century. She is born in Damascus, in Syria, and she has a book which was recently translated into English by Homerine. It's the Book of Love. It's a really interesting book which describes her, how to say, her philosophy when it comes to love when it comes to God, yes, but also when it comes to other humans, with the humans and to the world as such. So it's approximately 150 pages, and she refers to a lot of thinkers and philosophers for the last 800 years in her book.
So it sounds like from your research that women have been pretty prominent throughout history, and maybe if not necessarily our culture and kind of the Western canon, but obviously around the rest of the world.
Right. Exactly. When it comes to also the Greek philosophers, we also have, we know about Hypatia from today's Egypt in the 5th century. A book rather recently was published, and it said that Socrates and Diotima, that she was very important for Socrates, actually. So also when it comes to the Greeks, there are, how to say, new ways of looking at philosophy, which, and those ways, they, how to say, describe it in a little bit different way than what has happened for the last couple of 100 years. Because this, as Peter Park has demonstrated in his book from 2013, this is a rather new way of looking at philosophy when it comes to viewing it as a, how to say, white male phenomenon. You know, it's before the 1820s, women were often included in the history of philosophy. And actually, one of the symbols of philosophy, that was actually women. So now the women, that goes back to the old Egypt as well, with Seshet. And when it comes to also the Greeks, they had this a woman as a symbol of philosophy. But things started to change in the late 1700s, and when it comes to Kant, for example, he was, how to say, not very positive when it came to women, nor people of another color than his own. So,
So that set the pace for our mainstream view, at least in mainstream culture, as far as women's role in philosophy. It took a turn there, you're saying.
Yeah, Peter Park has, demonstrated that in his book of 2013, and Brian Van Orden at Yale NUS and at Vassar College, he has in his book from 2016, multicultural manifesto for philosophy. That book also demonstrates that this is a rather new, ideology to exclude people of color and exclude women from philosophy. So that happened after Kant and Hegel in the 1820s. So that's what they are demonstrating, Park and Van Orden, that after the 1820s, it was pretty much settled when it comes to Europe and in the Americas. Yeah. So this was kind of that rather racist way of looking at other people, actually. Yeah. That's what's
And do we have any evidence in terms of, let's say, the sources or the foundation of this exclusion? Like, why is it that these sort of white people in the, kind of the main, now major canon of philosophy, why was it that they felt so threatened by these marginalized groups?
Right. That's a rather complex. It has to be said that, the late 1700s, it was, this was an era of, slavery, of colonialism, and these European empires and states, they, rule the world or try to rule the world. Mm-hmm. And I guess this is one way of doing it, and that is actually to, exclude Asians and Africans from the history of philosophy. I've also actually by chance read a text from 1733 in Germany, because at that time, that was the early Enlightenment in Europe. And one of the philosophers who was teaching in Halle, the University of Halle, and Wittenberg, where Martin Luther actually lived a couple of 100 years earlier. That was Anton Wilhelm Amo, okay? And he was actually born in Ghana, in today's Ghana. And he was brought to Europe as a slave, but he was raised as a rather rich child, and he got the best education, and he ended up with a PhD, or a doctorate, as they called it in those days, in philosophy. And he started to teach philosophy at the best universities in Germany, in today's Germany, in the 1730s. And one of the texts I've read from the rector Krauss at the University of Halle and Wittenberg, he hails this African philosopher, and he, not because he has, grown into a European kind of thinking, but he claims that the reason why Amo is so intelligent and smart is because he understands him as a part of African philosophy. And he refers to, in this text from 1733, he refers to, for example, Augustine or Terence these Amazigh people, that means Amazigh means, well, often called Berbers, but actually from North Africa. And they were very vital in the development of Christianity. And if you read Augustine, he is defining himself as an African in contrast to the Roman Europeans.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's in the letters of Augustine. So he argues, so this is another way of, so there is a lot here. I can continue for ages. But if you look at the sources, his mother, the mother of Augustine, Monica, she was an Amazigh. That means original population of northern Africa. And so, Augustine defined himself as an African, and so did actually Kraus, the rector at the University of Halle in 1733. That means 1300 years later. But my point is, something happened between the 1730s and the 1760s, 1770s, and gradually 1780s.
Yeah.
So things started to happen. We can read David Hume, for example, in 1754. He starts to write very negative against African people. So that, and then you have this whole new. By chance, this is called the Enlightenment. When it comes to some parts of it, I would rather say that that's the dark ages.
Wow. So, I mean, just to make sure that we have it clear. So you're saying that according to Augustine, that African philosophy was influential in Christian thought?
Yeah, well, as we all agree upon, according to the present standard canon of today, right? Augustine is important, right? I mean, he is the most important Christian philosopher, actually, isn't he? From those early days, you got Anselm a little bit later, but according to Martin Luther as well, I mean, Augustine is the most important philosopher. No, by chance, he was no European, he was, according to himself, he was an African.
Yeah.
So, and some will say, well, he was a Roman. He did write in Latin. And then, and you might say that about Salman Rushdie as well, or Arundhati Roy, or to take anyone today, they write in English, yes, but it doesn't, but they still define as, I guess, Indian or whatever, right? So the interesting thing I would say is, how do they define themselves? And when it comes to Augustine or Terence of Carthage, they define themselves as Amazigh, or the original African inhabitants of that northern region. And if you read Augustine, he also refers to the desert fathers of Egypt as one of those who were influential when it comes to his conversion into Christianity.
Wow.
So, yeah, then again, this is another example. When it comes to how I read the canon a little bit differently than the standard version of today.
Is there any reason that he might have stated why the Egyptian philosophy helped him to decide to convert to Christianity? Any kind of reasoning for that?
This is now we're into rather Christian thinking and philosophy. So these desert fathers, as they were called, like Abba Anthony. They lived from the 200s CE, Common Era. So they were. So they started to move into the desert. Actually, also there were desert mothers who also entered the desert in order to live for themselves and develop their attachment to God and Christianity. So yeah, I was just referring to that. Augustine was referring to them as one of one of those who were influential for his conversion. So yeah, it wasn't he traveled also to Italy, or today's Italy, and Rome, but I would claim that it's possible to look upon Augustine as more of an African philosopher. And if we read his main books, I would yes, I would say that we can define him as an African. And he argued against the Roman Empire when it comes to understanding the Christianity. So we have a very important council on the 1st of May 418, where the African Christian thinkers were having a statement against Rome. So again, now we are into how to say Christian philosophy, and but my decolonial way of looking at this is a little bit different than the standard colonial way of looking at this development of Christianity. So yes, I would say that it's possible to describe it in a little bit different way. And the interesting thing is that I'm basing my thinking a little bit on what Krauss, this rector at the University of Halle in today's Germany, wrote in 1733, right? So before the turn or the wave started to go in another direction from the 1750s and so on.
Yeah, so this version of decolonialized history, what you could call true history, it's so important to talk about and to highlight and make sure it's mainstream and that people understand. I'm actually really happy. I didn't, some of the things that you're revealing here, I'm finding out for the first time. And I wouldn't call myself a scholar of any sort as far as history is concerned, but still, as someone who maybe could identify with the common man or layman or something like that, it's very interesting to be hearing this for the first time, and I hope anyone who learns about this can learn about it and share it also with other people, because this is it's monumental. This is what actual history is, not someone else's version of it.
And you know what this reminds me of? I don't know if you guys ever read the book When Things Fall Apart. So it's really one of my favorite books. So one of the most poignant parts of that book is, so it's essentially about these I think it was British conquerors, right, who kind of came to Africa, and they sort of they saw these primitive people and they said, well, these are the savages, right? We have to kind of save them, right? They were missionaries. And so what they find in somewhere in the context in the middle of the book is that essentially the religions are virtually the same. And so I don't remember who the character was who said it, but he said something along the lines of I don't understand why they don't understand that our religions are virtually the same. They say that we don't believe in their God, but we actually do, right? The way we just sort of embody those religious beliefs is a bit different, but actually we believe in one God, right? So we're not polytheists. And so the point of the book was to show that essentially these various philosophies that seem so different actually aren't. And that a lot of the sort of the things that, well, this isn't part of the book, but this is my interpretation. A lot of the beliefs that we have, right, in the sort of in the white canon is sort of borrowed from other cultures, that none of these ideas are essentially original. Dag, would you agree?
Right. Totally. And personally, I would say also I'm influenced by Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his book of 1986. It's called Decolonizing the Mind. So that's how it all started, how to say, this rather recent development when it comes to decolonizing. We got Linda Toohey Smith in 1999 as well, and Gurminder Bamra, Decolonizing the University, in a book from 2018. So these books are important, I would say, because they're trying to also give a new reading of the canon, try to see things in a little bit different way. And just reminder that, when I'm talking now, it's not that precise, right? So I would rather refer to my books and my articles at skokie.org or something in order to get those, precise quotations, and my pronunciation of the names are not perfect. No. Just saying. But so where are we? Well, when it comes to religion, as you mentioned, it comes to Chinua Achebe, you referred to his book, I think. Yes. Again, from my point of view, and I think I can, argue for that very strongly, is that, Christianity is no European religion. Nothing. It's, it actually developed much of it in Africa. Yeah. And remember, the earliest Christian nation on this planet, save Armenia, but that's Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is the oldest Christian nation. We know that the state was converted into Christianity in the 330s. We can read it in the Acts 8 in the Bible. It says that an Ethiopian nobleman was in the region south of Jerusalem, and he was converted into Christianity as actually, I think, the first or one of the very first foreigners ever to be converted into Christianity. So remember, the Roman Empire didn't convert into Christianity before 386-87 CE, Common Era, right? So it was for hundreds of years. That was not the place. Europe was not the place for developing Christianity. So that was why Augustine and Terence and all these North African philosophers with a Mosaic background, they were developing the thought of Christianity. And and so that was just my point. I was trying to say that Christianity is not a European religion.
And so just to, I think, kind of sort of pivot just for the sake of time, we also want to focus on the other article that I found to be super influential. So this is Dag's article called or titled "The Radical Philosophy of Egypt, Forget God and Family Right." So phenomenal article, phenomenal title name. And so I want to start out with this quote from Dag. So Dag writes, "The existential message of the immortality of writers, written by Irsesh, echoes through the centuries and millennia, over sand dunes and oceans, before finally reaching us now in the 21st century. Thinking and writing is more important than religion, materialism, and even more controversial, one's own family. Man perishes," he writes. "His corpse turns to dust. All his relatives return to the earth, but writings make him remembered in the mouth of the reader. A book is more effective than a wall-built house or a tomb chapel, better than an established villa or a stela in the temple." So Dag, my question is going to be, because that's such a phenomenal quote, how is it that sort of the writing of Irsesh has affected you, and what does it mean to be immortal through writing?
Wow. Well, my interest is basically to try to bring forward some of these lost voices of philosophy and of literature and of the global history of ideas. And this text that you quoted is actually written 3,200 years ago, 1200 BCE, before the Common Era. And so that means, 800 years before Socrates and Aristotle. And I think that's, I've written this article in cooperation with Joachim Kwok at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. So at least he has, he's an expert when it comes to Egyptology. And he has, approved the translation. That said, this text is actually has been made accessible by Toby Wilkinson. His book of 2016, The Ancient Writings of Egypt. So I would recommend that book. It's rather easy, accessible. And he has translated a lot of interesting texts from 2200 before the Common Era. That means 4,200 years old texts, and all the way down to 1,000 years before the Common Era, 3,000 years ago. So there are so many interesting and important and vital texts from Egypt and they have not been translated or made accessible to the public in general. So they are translated, yes, but in very scholarly productions. And books and volumes. So Toby Wilkinson, for example, he has made it accessible in a Penguin edition, and that helps. And there are many similar texts like this that I would say can make us think about philosophy in a completely different way, at least how it all started, And these texts of philosophy from Egypt also explains, I would say, they also explain why Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and the Greeks, why they also always claimed that philosophy was from Egypt. They didn't. The Greeks didn't say that. Oh, we invented, philosophy ourselves. Socrates, he wrote that Pythagoras and Solon, that they all traveled to Egypt in order to gain knowledge. We know that, according to Strabo, he was a historian, Greek historian living a couple of hundred years after Plato, but he went to Egypt and supposedly found the house where Plato was living himself in Egypt. So that's according to Strabo. Now, if you read the standard canon of the US or the Europeans, they will tell you that, it was probably just fantasizing and Plato didn't go to Egypt or stuff. So, but if you read Phaedrus of Plato, we can see that he quotes Socrates and saying that everything, important when it comes to writing and arithmetic and thinking, that was from Egypt. Yeah. So it says in that text, that's what the Greeks were saying and writing themselves. Look at Isocrates, for example. He said the same thing, that the most famous, and Isocrates, he was actually older than Plato, and he said that, the foremost of the Greek philosophers and thinkers, they went to Egypt. If you read Aristotle, that's another interesting thing, because we are generally presented with the so-called facts that democracy hailed from Athens, right? The Greeks, right? But if we read the politics of Aristotle, we can see that that's not what he was writing. He's writing that Carthage of Tunisia. That's the most important city when it comes to development of democracy or a good rule. So they had the oldest system in Carthage. That was a city founded 800 years before the Common Era. Mm-hmm. So according to Aristotle in Politics, which is a rather influential book, I would say, but he compares the constitutions of three different cities, and that's Sparta, Crete, and in the end, Carthage of Tunisia in today's northern Africa. And the conclusion is pretty much that the people of the Phoenicians of Carthage, that they were the ones who had the oldest and the best and the most stable democracy or the rule of law according to the constitution.
Wow. How further back was this from Athens, when Athens developed their democracy? How many years before?
Yeah, that should make it 400 years earlier. But yeah, that's it. Okay, let me rephrase that. Okay, the city of Carthage was approximately, according to the sources, founded at the year 800. So when they developed democracy, this is interesting because Aristotle, as we know, he didn't say that democracy or mob rule in itself was the best thing, right? He also wanted a more, stable...
right, he wanted a representative republic, yeah.
Right. So, but what's also interesting is that if you read John Adams, and I guess all of you in the U.S. know about John Adams, the second president of the U.S., but if we read him, we can see that who does he refer to when it comes to the best rule? Well, that's Carthage. He didn't refer to Athens.
Wow.
Right? And now we're talking the 70s, 1790s. Oh, I could talk a lot about the U.S. Constitution and that part, but I won't go into that too much. But if we at least refer to John Adams, so he writes that Carthage was his best example of a good democracy plus, or whatever we should call it, right?
Yeah.
Because that democracy word is not easy to define, but at least John Adams, he didn't point to Athens. At the time, Athens was a part of the Ottoman Empire as well, so it was not this rather new craze for the Greeks. That's a rather new movement, I would say, after the 1820s and 1830s. So the U.S. Constitution, that was in the 1700s, right? And the Greeks weren't that popular at the time, so it seems like John Adams had read Aristotle. The strange thing is that people of today, they don't seem to have read Aristotle too much, or Herodotus for that matter. He didn't refer to the Greeks either when it comes to the implementation of democracy.
Wow. And so in your article, you also write, Irsesh raises an internal philosophical dilemma. What is more important, doing good for the humans to come or doing good in life right now? So apparently it seems like for him the answer is obviously sort of doing good for humans to come. And so how come you think that writing in the form of symbolic immortality was more important to him than establishing, what can be kind of conceptualized as the good life in the present? Why was he so future-oriented, do you think?
Oh, wow, yeah. That's a rather existential question.
Well, from his writings. Do we know anything?
It's hard to say. But what's surprising with this text from Egypt, 3,200 years old, is that, it's like it's not what we think it is. It's we think we are taught to believe. I would say in our colonial system, we are taught to believe that Egypt, they were just concerned about religion or death or something. But if there are so many texts that prove that theory wrong, it's like so this Ursus text. He says that we shouldn't care about the ancestors that much, Mm-hmm. So that's how to say the opposite of what we generally perceive that the people of Egypt of the ancient Egypt were saying or being taught to believe. So he says that live today and make great works for the future generations to come. So he says, how to say, yes, be a philosopher, be a writer. That's another name of that text of his, mm-hmm. By the way, be a writer. So he says that it's more important to write for eternity than to, how to say, hail your ancestors, or he actually, or it might be a she as well. Mm-hmm. We don't know for sure. But it also says that, it's more important than your own kids. So this is a little bit rather radical, mm-hmm. I would say, philosophy. So I don't know if we are ready for that yet, or if ever. But at least it's an interesting discussion to have. What's more important, today or tomorrow? And I would personally say, that I think it's great that he or she wrote those texts all these thousands of years ago, and for us today, it gains a lot, just to read those texts. And so luckily, there are people around that, think more about the generations and futures to come than they think of their own good just today.
Yeah. And Alen, you had some ideas you wanted to talk about?
It sounds like what Ursesh wants us to know is, one, to live life today, but at the same time also be a writer, so that as he said in a quote, a name in the mouth of the people will surely be effective in the afterlife. Meaning, right. The names will be on the lips of men for years to come. And there's a sort of, as you wrote in the article, an immortality to that, to these ideas. And then when people read these ideas, they become like heirs to those ideas. And that's fascinating because, of course, the Egyptians, they created mausoleums, tombs, gigantic pyramids, but these things come and go. But it's evident that writing is one thing that happens to stay immortal, and that's what Ursesh seems to point to, and you point to as well.
Right. And by the chance, he lived just 100 years after Akhenaten, who was a very important pharaoh or ruler of Kemet, or Egypt as we know it. So Kemet is the original name of Egypt. And Akhenaten, he was very important because he actually threw away all these old classical gods of Egypt, and he turned into some kind of monotheism, So he believed in one God, or in one sun, so to say. So he started this worship in cooperation with his wife, Nefertiti. Mm-hmm. So they started to worship the sun, or one God. And it has been said that, they were, again, thrown from power. They were removed from power, and after a while, Egypt or Kemet went back to their how to say old gods. But I think the country was changed forever because of this rather revolutionary way of introducing one god or one a completely new religion. It was rather radical, and this changed Egypt. And some will say it changed history. Some are claiming that there is a connection here between the development of monotheism within Judaism and the other Abrahamic religions.
And Dag, for you, I wanted to ask, in terms of symbolic immortality and creativity, right? So for all of us, so we have a podcast, right? We're writers, so we do all of these different things. I mean, it can successfully, I think, be argued to sort of alleviate our sense or our fear of death and mortality. And I wonder for you, what do you think is the connection, and how sort of close the connection do you think it is between creativity and that sense of symbolic immortality, or even emotional well-being as a whole? Like, how important do you think it is to be creative for us as human beings?
Wow, yeah, right. Yes, it seems to be one of the most important things, how to say, ever. That's what makes us human, I think, right? Mm-hmm. But that said, I mean, there are so many ways of, how to say, arranging our lives. So, I mean, it's possible to be a hockey player or a carpenter as well, and that's just as important because it gives happiness to a lot of people, right? Mm-hmm. So I would also how to say, approve of those ways of lives. And but that said, I think, well, all can enjoy sports, and but I think all can enjoy philosophy as well. Mm-hmm. And for many people, that's the most important thing. And in the long run, I think that might be more worth than a gold medal in the Olympics for the humanity as a whole. That people at least create works that can influence other people, and at least we are connected throughout the ages. And I think these old texts from Egypt, or the text from Sorihuana of Mexico, for example, in the 1600s, is another example of how men and women can talk to each other or understand each other throughout the ages. I mean, when we read those texts, I would say it doesn't matter what kind of era or what kind of country they are written in. I mean, they talk to us, these texts, and I think that's important.
Yeah, and so we had a guest on a few weeks ago. Her name is Stephanie Kent. And so we had pretty much an entire episode on literature and books and how we relate to them and how they essentially relate to us. And the main point, or one of the, I guess you can call them the major conclusions that we came to, was that essentially the thing that makes books so powerful is that essentially not only that we empathize with other people, but that we also get to sort of learn about ourselves through them. And what's so amazing about the writing, and I think what does make it immortal, is the fact that all of us can identify with these texts that were even written hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands, sometimes years ago. Sometimes you can even find sort of cave wall paintings, right, that kind of resonate with us, which is so wild.
Yeah,
like you would never expect that.
Right, right. It's amazing. And I think what art and philosophy gives us is, I guess, that it gives us this sense of common humanity. We can understand each other, and I don't think people have changed that much for the last 3,000 years. It seems like if you read one of those texts from Egypt, for example, the teachings of Patutep, that's written 4,000 years ago. So there are several of those teachings. They are teaching their kids how to behave. So they have like some of them 40, 50 different maxims, so different rules. And those rules are, how to say, so up to date. It's rather weird. So I think most people can, how to say, relate to it or maybe use them when it comes to raising kids. Because it says how to behave when it comes to, how to say, rich people and poor people, and try to treat people in a good way. And well, it's much more sophisticated than I'm paraphrasing now, right? So it's so interesting to read because it's the same dilemmas that we have today. It seems like then that the same ones that they had in Egypt 4,000 years ago.
Yeah. And Alan, for you, I wanted to know what stood out for you about the sort of the words or the teachings of your sesh.
Well, one thing that's fascinating is back to that idea of immortality through writing, through having your work read. How fascinating is the internet today? Because it's like a compilation of all the knowledge that we have in the world, basically allowing that to have a sort of immortality as well. And I think that's fascinating because your work, the works of others, this podcast, for instance, any kind of writing, it's all being collected and stored online. And what's fascinating is if nothing happens to the internet, of course anything can happen, but say nothing does, that's fascinating how much knowledge we have stored of humanity. And as time goes on, say we hold on to it, it's fantastic that we'd have it all, well, not in one place because it's not a physical location, but we have something to reference. And it's great because information that we gain now and information that we discover from the past, if we don't lose the internet, we'll probably never be able to lose information again, as long as nobody alters anything, I suppose. But barring that, that's fascinating because anything that we'll reference in the future, we'll be able to never lose it again, as we've lost like other types of history. Like for example, the burning, the burning of the Library of Alexandria. There's so many documents, a lot of Egyptian history as well that was lost, if I'm not mistaken. And we can have things like that never repeat again by holding on to our history for ages to come. So it's fascinating.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's true. I think we have a great opportunity now, to spread knowledge and to, how to say, reread the canon, the classical text, to read new texts. There is such an opportunity to do that now. That said, there are also backlashes, to this. So many people will, because of this, how to say, global internet and all the possibilities, it feels so overwhelming, it seems like, so different nations will, how to say, stick to their own version of history and claim that their nation or country is, how to say, different or superior to others. So that's also a global trend we see these days, right? So, it goes a little bit both ways here. I'm not sure where this whole world is going. It's going to be fascinating to see.
Yeah, that's true. But also, what's interesting is the work of Tony Wilkinson, as you mentioned before. A lot of the scholarly texts that he made very, how should I say, like digestible for a mainstream audience. It sounded like you were saying there's even more things that have been translated from ancient Egyptian texts that just haven't been made available to the public yet. So that's fascinating to see what's to come with that as well. And I'm sure that'll be released on the internet and that'll have its own momentum. I do agree with you, though. Yes, there could be countries that would say no, our history is correct, this one is inferior, and things like that. But it's possible that new information might have a momentum to it, depending on how it's shared and spread. But I agree
Right.
with you. It is a very iffy thing, and we have to see how it goes. Yeah.
And just,
Yeah.
Dag, I would have just want to read one last quote from you and just ask you one final question before we wrap up. So,
Right.
back to the article on non-European women in the Western canon. So, Dag wrote, the numbers will reveal that women of color in the U.S. and in Europe, for that matter, are better represented in natural sciences than in academia's oldest field, in this case, philosophy. So, no other discipline in the humanities is less diverse in terms of the curriculum, students, and professors. The philosophy departments, journals, and curriculum lists are often as lacking in diversity now as they were in the 1970s. And so for you, Dag, I'm sure this is something that you've probably talked about and probably even thought about extensively. What would you say is the remedy for that, or the sources of remedy?
Well, podcasts like this, I guess. I think that's important to spread the word, to spread the knowledge. I think one of the main problems of today is probably that we have been fed into this system. I call it the colonial system. And this system for the last at least 100, 200 years, it's often based on these national criteria, right? Or so-called Western, in Europe and in the US, they call it Western civilization stuff. And I think that's it's just not correct. When I checked how the sources, it doesn't fit with those that ideology, which says that this is some kind of Western unity or something. That's also rather new term after the World War One in 1920s. That was when that Western idea grew and was introduced into academia. So, well, the remedy is it's a lot of how to say work. That's one thing, and we need a lot of interested people who can spread the knowledge. And if they want to read other, how to say, philosophers or other texts than the standard. The standard ones, well, I guess people have to stand up and tell it as it is, and spread knowledge about what they can read on the internet of articles or in books, of course. And but that said, I think it's also difficult to change too much actually at the universities because there is so much money going into this system as well, and so if we follow the money, I don't think too many have very much to gain on this, that to decolonize or to give a completely new understanding of philosophy or the humanities, so it's not going to be too easy, I would say.
That's why we have this renegade podcast.
I'm sorry?
No, I said that's why we have this renegade podcast.
Right, exactly. That's why we need you guys. And well, but there is a world outside the universities as well, I guess. And but I mean, it's just to keep reading, keep writing, keep podcasting.
Alen, final questions?
Dag, where could we find more work by you if we wanted to find something, let's say, online?
Right. Okay, I have this site, skoki.org, SGOKI.org. And so I've collected the texts there, and I'm trying to quote cooperate with other institutions like Glocknos at Cambridge University and Brian Van Orden at Vassar College, and Cosmopolis, a journal in Belgium. I'm trying to edit and make an issue on these questions.
Yeah.
So I guess it's all out there on the web, I guess.
Yeah, and you guys can also find Dag's work on aeon.com. That's aeon.com, which is a philosophical website where a ton of philosophers and academics contribute.
Right.
Yeah. And Dag, can you, for our audience, give us your Twitter handle and your Facebook?
Right. It's at, oh my God, it's my last name. It's so difficult. I mean,
It's okay.
difficult
We'll have a link in
also
the
in
description.
Scandinavia.
Yeah.
But it's Twitter at DAG HERBJORNSRUD. Now that was easy. But just Google me or whatever, and you'll find it. You'll find me.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was such an enlightening show.
Pleasure. So interesting.
Yeah.
Sure. Anytime.
Thank you, Dag.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dag. Have a great day. Thank you.
Likewise.
And guys, remember to like us on Instagram and Facebook at Seize the Moment Podcast and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Remember to subscribe.
Hit the bell.
Hit the bell. And one thing I just wanted to read before we go. I didn't do it with Dag, but this one was very interesting. I built a monument more durable than bronze and higher than the royal pyramids. I shall not wholly die. And that was cool. And it's actually followed by this, I believe this is Latin, Exegi monumentum eri perennius regalic situ pyramidum atlius. It was cool. When I read it to myself before he was even on, I was just like, okay, this feels powerful. Like I'm uttering words that have not been uttered in ages. I felt like that.
We're keeping the legacy going.
Yeah.
All right.
But guys, tune in to the next episode. It'll be episode 22, and look forward to Emmy Zen in the future. It won't be the next one. It'll be the one after the next one.
Yep.
But see you guys next week.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.